Well, hello, my name is Andre Koen. I want to say thank you so much for joining us in this conversation today. We're going to spend some time talking about really thinking about what it means to be a mediator. And so, first and foremost, I want to say thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. You could be any place in the world, but you've chosen to be with us today. So, just a little bit about me. I am the Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Revo Health. And I spend my volunteer time as a mediator, both in the community as well as in organizations, helping people to figure out better ways to solve our collective problems. And so I want to say thank you so much for joining us in this conversation. I also think it's important to recognize that kind of why we oftentimes find ourselves in conflict situations. And so before we go too far down the proverbial rabbit hole, I would like to kind of talk about some of the basic principles that kind of drive our work, right? Or how we should be thinking about these things as mediators. So we'll jump into that. So I want to talk a little bit about first of all this picture. And so when something that is helpful. Oh, you know what? Actually, let me pay some bills first. Let me do this before we get into this other stuff. This actually is a part of our membership drive, and so before we kind of get into the meat and potatoes or tofu and carrots of this thing, I want to I do want to draw attention to the fact that we're having a membership drive, and we're asking those of you who are already our members to make sure you re-up. But we also want you to invite folks to be a part of this wonderful organization. And so what are some of the benefits of membership is or discounts to our trainings and conferences, right? Is also getting the access to live webinars just like this. It's also it's also a place for us to kind of develop a community of practice, right? So we get to talk about, ask questions, be mentored and coached by folks who are already in the field. So we want to extend that opportunity to you as members. And if you are not a member, we hope that you watch these presentations, check out our website, and become a member. As a matter of fact, I believe Lori and I just finished working on some continuing legal education courses that we're so excited to be rolling out as a part of the membership drive, right? So we'll give those opportunities first to our members, and then hopefully we'll share those with the rest of the community. But yeah, membership has its privileges, right? So let's go back to kind of talking about what are some of the ways that we should be or could be thinking about our role. So in this conversation, in the time that we spend, I really want us to recognize that oftentimes conflict in and of itself is an illusion. Conflict is an illusion. What are you talking about, Andre? How can conflict be an illusion? I mean, this person their tree is dropping leaves on my yard. That is very real. What are you talking about? Those the neighbor down the street, their dog keeps pooping in my boulevard, in my part of the boulevard. What do you mean that's an illusion? No, that's real, right? I'm being evicted from my home because the landlord is, so that's very real. And so what I would suggest is that you're absolutely right, that those conflicts as they manifest have some real consequences, some real weight, some real some real tangible the behaviors, right? Consequences. And so yeah, no, that stuff is real. So I don't mean to dismiss it, belittle it, or whatnot. But what I would also suggest is that as people come into conflict, they are oftentimes after very much the same things. Right. And so what are people after? Typically, people are after safety, they're after significance, and they're after belonging. Right. So people are after safety, significance, and belonging as a part of how they see the world. And so if we're able to recognize that, then what we then see as conflict actually may be just a difference in how we achieve getting that safety, significance, and belonging. Right. And so so how I talk to my neighbor about their tree and their leaves is important to how we can resolve that conflict. Most often, my neighbor did not calculate and say, you know what, today I'm going to drop 47 leaves on my neighbor's property. That typically is not how that goes down, right? What typically is happening is that your neighbor is just carrying on in their day-to-day life and may not even be thinking about those things until you've brought that to their attention. And depending on how we brought that to people's attention, oftentimes that's where this notion of conflict can come in, because if I feel disrespected or embarrassed or whatnot, I'm certainly going to have a different kind of reaction to a request than if I am if I've been approached in a respectful, dignified, problem-solving centered way, right? So so that's important to recognize, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. The other aspect that and we'll just kind of go through these because I think it's really important that if you want to be helpful in navigating conflict, it is important to focus your attention on the goals. So first and foremost, what is your goal in engaging this person to have a conversation? And in the case of a mediator or a neutral, a certified neutral, it is to help the parties figure out how to solve their own problems, right? So that's ultimately our goal, which then means that we act and interact with them in a particular kind of way that allows them to do that. But we also, we're not so passive to not stand up for making sure that people are heard. Right. So one of the things that was it was funny, I taught middle school, and in that middle school process, every so often, kids would curse in the classroom, and most folks would recognize that oftentimes that's probably not the most nurturing environment for education, or equitable environment for education to happen. And so I would say, there would be, consequences, or I'd say, Jeff, can you use different language or whatever? But where I would draw the line, the place that I would say it was things were unacceptable in my classroom is when students would tell other students to shut up. Right. So they would tell other students to shut up. And so as a facilitator of that process, I found that to be probably the most disrespectful thing that one could say, because what they were saying, and they didn't necessarily know this, or people typically don't realize this when they engage in that kind of language, is that not only do I not want to hear from you, what you're uttering is of absolute no importance, i.e., thus you are of no importance, right? And so when we think about how we engage and how we help mitigate conflict, that becomes really important. And so in the example of this picture, we recognize that both of these people have a perspective that is not wrong. It is not a wrong perspective. However, if they want the other to understand their perspective, there's a particular kind of way they have to engage in that conversation, right? Engage in that conversation so that we can get into, what I believe oftentimes that the truth lies in the middle of whatever conflict we find ourselves in, right? And again, these conflicts are illusion as so much that it's really about the methods and not really that not really the values that cause us to be in conflict, right? The other thing is that we need to align our thoughts and our behaviors to our values. And so this is an interesting piece because what I value, I have to, it's something that I hold dear and sacred. So whether someone else values that or not, or they hold that sacred, or if they respect that, that has nothing to do with me, right? And so it's important for me to align my behaviors with the values that I hold for other people. I remember being in a conversation with a guy, and he turns around and he says, I don't like, and I'll just use a better term, but he used really a harsh term. And he said, I don't like Black people. And again, he used a more harsh term. And so the way that he used that language and the way that that was going down, he was not talking about me. And he was not talking about people who look like me. But I had choices in this particular situation. I could, A, give this guy a piece of my mind. B, I could punch him in the face for saying something so disrespectful, or I could hold fast to my values, right? And so what my values say is that people have a right to their opinion, and with that right to their opinion, they also there's some responsibilities that come with that right, which means that if you can say something, then I can say something back. And so we engaged in this conversation, and ultimately, after a few learning opportunities for him, he came back around to me and he said, you know what, I don't like Black people, but I like you, right? So this was an interesting, bizarre situation, but I was going to hold fast to my values. And so, and again, I'm not suggesting that this is what everyone should do and that this is the appropriate response in every situation. I'm not suggesting that. I'm saying in my particular situation at that particular time, this is what I did because I was going to hold on to my values. And so I said, when you say that word or you think about that, or, what does that mean? And he gave me all these negative things. And I said, well, do you know white people who fit those descriptions as well? And he looked at me and he was like, yeah, I do. And then we started talking about other things and we went on and on and on. And so he was like, well, I got to go. And I'm like, cool, I'm out, So I take care of my business. I'm grabbing lunch at the time. So I grab my lunch, I start heading out the door. And this guy meets me at the door and he says, hey, hold on. And he hands me this damp napkin with his number on it. He said, I raise I raise chickens. If you ever need fresh eggs, give me a call. So I took his paper. I didn't call him. I had no interest in furthering a relationship, but I was holding to my values. And by holding to my values, I think this person who may have had some negative thoughts about people who he thinks look like me, thoughts about my ethnic group or my intelligence or our communication styles. I think he had these fantasies going on in his head. And for whatever reason, he wanted me to fulfill those fantasies for him or to live those fantasies through our interaction. But that's not how I live my values. Those aren't, right? So in that particular case, he called me a name that my mom and dad did not give me. He referred to all of these things, and I could have responded in ways that his fantasy wanted me to, right? I had every right to be angry and I could stand on righteous indignation and I could give, don't you dare, right? but what would that have done for him? Was something that I could not control, but it was not in keeping with my values. Right. And so when we think about what it means to be a mediator, what it means to help people working through conflict, no matter what they do, it is our responsibility to hold fast to those principles in the agreement, right? To hold fast to those principles that we know to be effective, that help people navigate through conflict, navigate through to problem solving. Right. And so, again, I'm not saying that this is for everyone. I'm not saying that everyone should do this, but I would suggest that if we want to be effective in the space, holding to our values in the face of disrespect actually says more about us than it does about other people. Right. I also, and I don't want to belabor this point because I want to get to other points, but I've also been in situations where people have been disrespectful to me in ways that other people would not have dealt with it very good. And it's interesting what happens in that particular situation, because the atmosphere around you changes, because people say, well, how did you, I would have never been able to navigate the conflict in that way. I would, that was really good, and it's not that I'm good, it's that I'm holding to my values, and my values say, no matter what you do, I am in control of my behavior and in control of my emotions. And so I'm going to be me. I'm going to consistently be me. Right. And me is that person that likes to walk in the space of effectiveness, helping people to be effective. The next part of the kind of ground rules and agreements is, encouraging curiosity and not judgment, right? So people who are judgmental already have everything figured out. They will never be surprised by anything because they have it figured out. And when we're navigating conflict, when we're helping people, we're facilitating this process, it is a process of discovery, right? So the way that we help people discover their commonalities and their uniquenesses is actually what makes the conflict process work. Right. One of my favorite shows was Star Trek Next Generation. I don't know if anybody's ever watched that, but that was one of my favorite shows. And there was one particular episode that sticks out in my mind. And I actually should probably look up the episode number and name so people can go to that particular episode. But it was actually about mediation, which is kind of interesting. So they brought in this ambassador who was, galactically renowned for his ability to, help mediate conflict. And he had 3 people that went with him that he referred to as his chorus. Right. And so they had this mental telepathy between the 4 of them. And actually he couldn't speak. He could only he used sign language actually to communicate with his chorus. And so they go down to the planet to negotiate this war, this civil war on this planet. And so the 2 parties are there and they're fighting, and and this has gone on for, a long time, for many generations. And so the ambassador goes down with his chorus, and something happens and his chorus dies. Right. And so the ambassador who doesn't speak, who is deaf, it is the federation, the government says, you know what, we got to bring you back. It's too dangerous there. Your work, you are too important to us. So let's get you out of there. And the ambassador looked at his situation, and it looked absolutely hopeless, right? Because he's had this chorus for a long time. They were in tune. They had this mental telepathy connection and all this stuff. Again, this is Star Trek, right? But I think you'll get the principle in just a second. And so as as he's contemplating all of this stuff, he looks at his commanding officers and he says, "No, I'm going to stay." And they're like, "What are you talking about? You're going to stay in this hopeless situation where these people have been warring? They've killed your chorus." And again, holding fast to his values, recognizing the importance of the mission, he says, "You know what? Actually, I am going to stay, because this is an opportunity for me to teach these two warring factions how to communicate in a different way." And he taught them how to do, I'm sure it wasn't American Sign Language, in space, but essentially he taught them how to sign, and that was where they began to come together to create a peaceful environment. And so I like Gene Roddenberry's work in those subsequent shows, because they make us think differently, that we have to recognize that curiosity and not judgment is the answer. If I believe you are the devil coming out of a conflict, how or going into a conflict, how well do you, or I think you're evil, or your motives are you're wrong, or what? So part of our job as the mediator, as the central person, is to get people to be curious about the other, so that we can be in this creative space. The next thing I think is let me go back. The other part of that's important is to offer people what you need. And it's so funny, because oftentimes people will say, well, they didn't do it for me, so I'm not doing it for them, or they disrespected me, so I'm going to disrespect them. But at some point, and it's so funny, I was talking with my my daughter, who is 7, and it's a tough lesson, because she was she was being bullied by somebody. And I said, at some point you just gotta I don't know, you gotta not be bullied, right? And gave her some tips and that kind of stuff. And she said, "Dad, that's not gonna work." She said, "Dad, I have to do something different." And I was like, okay, now here I am. I'm a parent, right? I do this mediation stuff, and here I am telling my kid to resolve her or suggesting that she needs to resolve her situation with violence, because it's my kid, right? And so, but she looks at me, and I'm so glad she's my kid. She looks at me and she said, "Dad, I have to figure out a different kind of way." And I said, "Why is that?" She said, "Because the cycle will continue." And I'm like, "Oh, she's been listening to me," right? And so, so she was right, that we do have to she did have to find a different kind of way. And fortunately, it sounds like she has, right? So I don't have to be at school every day to know what's happening, but she, so she kept being this person's friend, and she kept doing these things. We put some things in place to make sure that she was physically safe. But my daughter said, I can figure this out. And I'm so proud of her for doing that at 7. I don't know that I was doing that at 7. And so we have to give people what we need. And even if they don't give it back, right? So that's what it means for us to be in the positions that we hold. And then the last thing is simply recognizing that that we have to give people grace. And the reason we have to give people grace, and I say have to, it's not very many times that I say have to, but we have to give people grace because people gave us grace, right? Now, I won't let everybody merge, but I'll let somebody merge because somebody let me merge, right? So I won't be a pushover, but because I was given grace, I would be a fool not to give that grace in return, to help someone grow and develop and learn. And so when we think about these ground rules and these agreements, to be quite honest, I only have one ground rule, which is treat people the way they want to be treated, which which sounds kind of quippy. It sounds kind of simple, but buried in that conversation is that I have to be in a relationship with this person to know how they want to be treated. I have to ask, I have to engage with them. I have to be, again, in relationship with them so that I can treat them in a way that they find equitable, right? That they find respectful, that they find helpful. Otherwise, I'm just doing it to gratify my own self, right? To do it because that's what feels good to me. So any questions, comments, observations before we kind of get into, and that's just the ground rules. I apologize if I went too far in depth in those, but it's not often that as mediators and navigators that we have this kind of time to kind of talk through some stuff. So any questions, comments about those ground rules and agreements?
Nope. Pretty self-explanatory.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, so let's get into some other conversations. What I'd like to kind of get us to start thinking about is how do we become effective in the space, particularly given how we're taught to interact with folks in the world, right? So typically when people see difference, what oftentimes is the response we're supposed to have when we see or interact with difference? What do people typically want us to say when we interact or we see difference? What's the polite thing to say when you see difference? Not necessarily what we say. Go ahead. What?
Nothing.
Okay, so sometimes we ignore differences, right? So there are some glaring differences, and we just kind of ignore them, right? We particularly, you know, if you're a parent, you direct your kids to don't say anything about that, right? What are some other approaches to difference that people encourage us to have, or oftentimes even have as they're trying to navigate conflict?
I would say patience.
Okay. People encourage patience. All right. Anyone ever heard someone make the suggestion that again, we ignore those differences because we're all the same? You know, the differences don't matter because we're all the same. Has anyone heard that line of rhetoric?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And what I would say is that is partially true. Remember, I said earlier that the truth is in the middle, right? So whatever whatever the poles are, somewhere in that middle is where the truth is. And I would say, yes, in many ways, we are very similar, right? I mean, our DNA structure allows, you know, folks from different ethnic and racial groups to procreate, right? So we are very, very similar. Organs, given the right blood type, can be, you know, exchanged between so-called, you know, racial or ethnic groups, right? So the oxygen that we need to intake, the way that our body mechanisms function, the food, right? All of that stuff, very, very, very similar. Simultaneously, there are some uniquenesses that we also have to keep in mind, right? And and some folks get nervous about recognizing those uniquenesses. They will say, well, isn't that racist? Right, to recognize those uniquenesses. And I would say, by gosh, no, it's not racist it makes sense to recognize those differences, right? The real question is, what do you do with that knowledge, right, of those commonalities and of those differences? It's what you do with that recognition that's important. Do you value one more than another? Do you give excuses for one that you don't give to another? Do you recognize how people came to have their set of ideas, how they came to have their set of behaviors or beliefs? And so it's important to recognize that, yes, we are very much alike, but we're also very unique because our perspectives and worldviews and contexts have driven us to have these different responses or different ways of interacting with the world. And so yeah, so oftentimes people go to this this place where they say, well, universally we are all the same, and in some respects that is in fact true. However, not recognizing the context that people come from, the time frames that they were raised in, the paradigms that they were given, will have you miss some opportunities that you could actually help people navigate more effectively through conflict. So the example that I like to use is this picture, right? And so if I water both of these plants the same, what is the outcome going to be for those plants? Right? What's the outcome going to be for those plants? And I would suggest that it would probably be a negative outcome for those plants. I would say that watering them both the same is easy for me, but I don't know that it would help the plants reach their full potential. And so that's what when we're talking about this idea of context and behaviors and being mindful of commonalities and uniqueness. That's why, because we don't want to miss those opportunities to be of service so that folks can reach their potential. So how do we start to get there? We have to be mindful, right? And we've talked about this in previous sessions. I just want to touch on this just for a little bit. That oftentimes people will behave in ways that are not aligned, right? And so oftentimes people respond with emotions because their emotions are not aligned with other aspects of their of how they want to or desire to respond, right? So being mindful really is about aligning our intentions, our values, our goals, and our behavior. So aligning those three so that every time I interact, every time I engage someone, I'm engaging in connection with my values, my goals, and my behaviors. And some people might say, well, what if some of those things change? That's great. Just recognize that that as your values change, you need to make sure that those things are realigned, right? So if I want to purchase a house, and I happen to love comic books, but I'm spending all of my money on comic books, I got to realign something, right? Because I'm not going to be able to purchase that house if I'm spending all my money on comic books. I'm not even paying bills. I'm buying comic books, right? So I have to realign some things. And so oftentimes in conflict, what is also happening is that people's behaviors and their intentions aren't aligned. Right. So, I'm walking my dog and I forgot my bag and my dog poops in my neighbor's yard. It wasn't my intention for my dog to do that. And so I have to make sure that I have bags, right? I also have to recognize that my neighbor doesn't want, I don't want dog poop in my yard, especially if it's not my dog, right? And so aligning your behaviors with your intentions, and correcting for those mistakes, right? So, if I'm there and my dog does that and I don't have a bag, there are a number of things that I could do. One is like come back and clean it up, right? Or if I see my neighbor out, say, you know what, I'm sorry, do you have a bag I can borrow, or whatnot, right? So there are ways that I can problem solve if I want to do that, if I'm being mindful, right? And so I would suggest that if we are not mindful, we could be mindless, right? And one of the things that I think is interesting about this idea of being mindless is that we become zombies. Have you ever seen any of those zombie movies? What's the major feature? Is that they do not have a mind. They are alive. They are, quote unquote alive. They are moving around. They function. They have functions, but they don't have any real purpose or gain other than to consume, right? Which that's a whole nother video for a whole nother time. Would love to talk about that. So it's important for us to be mindful. So one of the tools that I use for particularly dealing with cross-cultural conflict, or even cross-cultural communication or relationships, is many folks are familiar with the IDI, the Intercultural Development Inventory. And so I'm going to go over some pieces of that, and then I want to open up the floor for conversation as we kind of go through that. And so in the IDI, they have kind of these 5 dimensions. The first is that oftentimes people deny differences, right? Or they're in denial of differences. They recognize that we have some commonalities and differences, but deny the value of those things, right? Or I don't understand why those people don't like the Confederate flag, right? We all like flags, don't we? But they should be appreciative of my heritage with this Confederate flag. Well, possibly, but what we also recognize is that is a denial that other people's perspectives could be somewhat different, right? And then there's this notion of polarization, and polarization is good and bad, good or bad, right? So you are, if you are a conservative, you're evil, and if you're a Democrat, you're evil, right? So it's this polarization that my group is right and your group is wrong, that my group is good and your group is evil, right? And I go to evil because I use evil because that's like the furthest polarized aspect, right? So, I'm righteous and you're evil. And so that's important to recognize. So that's a type of polarization. There's another type of polarization where I say, you know what, my group is so bad and their group is so good, right? Oh, I wish my group could be like their group. If I had what their group had, I would be happy. Well, what do we know about this notion of polarization? We have 2 polar ends, and the truth is where? Somewhere in the middle, somewhere in between those polar ends. And so that's important to recognize. Oh, no, I wasn't done with that. The next is this notion of minimization. And this is where we say things like, I don't see color. People should just be more tolerant of each other. And in both of those communications, there's something missing. There's a problem, there's a gap, right? So this I'm colorblind, right, deals with kind of what we talked about before. We miss opportunities to see how we can be effective, or what might be motivating people in these contexts, or what societal parameters are putting around people's behavior. So we may miss that when we're in this minimization space, right? And tolerance just means to put up with. So people need to put up with more of something or someone. I don't know about that, right? I'm not so sure. And then there's this idea of adaptation, and adaptation is really about recognizing recognizing commonalities and differences, or recognizing commonalities and uniqueness, right? And then asking the question, well, what do I do with that? Right. So I recognize that there are these commonalities and these uniquenesses. So what do I do with that? That is when you're in a space of acceptance. And then lastly, adaptation is recognizing that not only are there these commonalities and differences between groups, or in groups, or around groups, but I must behave and act, if I want to be successful, in ways that that put me in those environments to be effective, right? So I have to understand how to move in and out of these groups, how to, what are some of the group norms? What are the taboos? How do I engage with these groups in different ways that I have to change, as opposed to expecting them to change? And I think that's probably the biggest thing about denial isn't so much that that I don't recognize these things about other groups, but actually I expect them to change, as opposed to me having to change given the context, right? So so those are some things to think about. And then I usually, when I engage in this as a part of a workshop, I'll give an assignment like this, right? And it's pretty small, so you may not be able to see it here, but the thrust of this, and maybe Laura, you can help me send this out as a PDF. But the thrust of this is really thinking about, how do we become more effective in working with groups? And so, is being in denial of difference recognizing, or trying to convince other people to change, particularly with these racial groups, does that make us effective? Does that make us ineffective? Or does that have no effect? So trying to change people. So if I want to change African Americans, does that, what impact does that have on my ability to be effective in working with them, right? When I think about this notion of polarization, and I say, my group is better than yours, when I'm working with the Latino community, or Latina community, is that helpful, right? Does that make me effective or ineffective? Or does it have no effect? When I think about this idea of minimization, and I say, well, I don't see race, people are people to me. When I'm engaging with my Asian brothers and sisters, does that make me effective or ineffective, right? And so forth and so on. So you can see how I use this chart to really think about how we can engage with each other, at least think about how we engage with each other in ways that are more effective, right? So ultimately, we want to get to a place where we are figuring out how to navigate this conflict space in ways that help us to achieve our goals. So, so with that, let's spend a little time talking. Let's talk. So I put a lot of stuff out there. We talked about a lot of different concepts. I'm curious if anyone has questions or comments.
Unmute. If you want to speak, unmute.
Okay. I will ask a question. All the things that you just put up in terms of those differences, though a lot of those things are cultural differences, for which we should not be, certainly not be judgmental in terms of one being better than the other. Just the fact that they are different, which is really more good than bad. I get that. The thing that I struggle with is the concept of truth. What exactly is true? Okay. And here's what I mean, okay? When you get into things that are, quote unquote, scientifically true, recognized by 99.9% of the scientific community that this is a fact, how do you deal with someone that says they're all wrong?
Yeah. So interestingly enough, I've really thank you so much for that question. I've been really challenged by that myself, right? So I'm digging into some psychology and dusting off some of my anthropology books and some of my psychology books to try to get to the root of that. I think the real question or a question that we could invite those people to step into our space or into a space to really think about or have conversations about that is really around this question: how does that work for you? Right. So there are some absolute truths, and and some people will say, well, there's not, and I don't know how I get around gravity, right? So gravity, or and is it gravity or heavier or lighter than air? I don't know that you can split. I mean, we can split hairs on that if we want to, but I would consider heavier than air is gravity, right? So there are those things. I cannot, one of the truths, these universal human truths, is I cannot bring back a life, right? So once my grandmother passed, there was nothing I could do to bring her back. I cannot reanimate her body or herself. So there are these things that are absolute truths.
Okay, can I make a comment? I mean,
yes, please.
I agree completely with what you're saying. But the issue is this. I mean, you're absolutely correct that, you mentioned things about like gravity and bringing people back from the dead, okay? My gut feel is, and I'm not an expert, but my feeling is basically 100% of the people out there hold those same views. I mean, those are sort of simple things that everybody, quote, basically everybody agrees to. The issue I'm talking about is things that are generally accepted as scientific facts, okay? But most people accept the person you're talking to. It is impossible. I mean, there's not very many things out there that are actually impossible, but my opinion, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that it is impossible to convince a climate change denier that climate change is caused by humans. You cannot do that with scientific facts, because their response is, yeah, but there's this one person who has a PhD from blah, 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 says that's not true.
Yep. So I will go back to, and maybe I went too far down the rabbit hole when I went down my little path, but I think, first of all, recognizing those universal truths sets the playing field, right? So, Donna said that that truth is relative. I'm not so sure about that, but we can talk about that too. I think setting the groundwork for that piece, that there are things we can't agree on, right? But the real question isn't so much, and I'm, I taught 8th grade, so I spent a lot of time with folks who didn't believe most of what I said, and so I had to recognize that my job wasn't to make them believe what I believed, but I had to set up information in such a way that they could make choices that would influence their behavior. So the question for me, and this is where I think a lot of people get stuck, for a so-called climate change denier, right? How, because some people believe that, it's a cyclical thing and the earth just does these cycles. Some believe that it's God is ordaining these things to happen the way they are, and so forth and so on. And so the real question so much isn't whether you believe it or you don't believe it, but what does that belief dictate about your behavior? How do you behave as a result of what you believe? So oftentimes it's easy to try to fight over the belief, but what I'm really curious about is the behavior. So let's say you don't believe in climate change. So are you going to recycle? Yes or no? It really kind of get people to think about that. Like, does it make sense to let toxic waste just whether you believe in that or not? So the belief actually is the shiny thing, when actually we want to work on, how does that dictate your behaviors?
And that's true. And those are, and I agree. I use climate change because that's sort of, that's one example.
Yeah.
But, you can get into things that are in today's world, maybe even more imminently toxic than climate change.
Like vaccine or anti-vaccine, right?
Right, exactly. And systemic racism or non-systemic racism, okay?
Yep.
But on the example that you just brought up, the vaccination stuff, okay? Sure, somebody is allowed to not be vaccinated. That's their personal choice. That's fine. The issue then becomes, as you correctly said, what is the outcome of that? In other words, are they just hurting themselves? If they are just hurting themselves, well, that's their right as a human being, as a sane human being, if they want to do that. However, if their belief is actually hurting other people, doesn't a line have to be drawn somewhere? That's the thing I sort of struggle with.
Well, so go ahead, Lori, you're going to say something?
No, I'm agreeing, because where do you draw the line? If you don't want to get vaccinated, you can carry it, make other people sick. So in that sense, it seems to be right to get the vaccine. But another thing is freedom. Can they make you get a vaccine? It's like, I see both sides, but
here's the funny, this is the thing I think is so funny. This is so funny to me because people talk about this notion of freedom, right? When they actually should be talking about liberty, which is a whole different thing. But this is so funny. So people say we have freedom, but that's not totally true and accurate.
right.
So my car goes 120 miles per hour. I will never, there's no place in Minnesota for me to drive that 120 miles per hour without having consequences. Right. So this notion of freedom, if you don't do right, but it's so funny, if your kid does not go to school, the parent pays the parent gets a ticket. The parent has to go to jail. And ultimately, if that continues to happen, what happens to parental rights? Where do they go? To the state.
Right.
The state will take your kids. So this notion of freedom, I always think is very interesting.
Well, I think the notion, I mean, there really is no such thing as total freedom in any kind of society. If anybody lives in a society, there is not and there should not ever be total freedom.
Yep.
To the point that you were making, we have to follow common rules that say you're not allowed to drive 120 miles an hour. So in every society, there is a lack of freedom for the common good.
Yep. And it's typically referred to as the social contract. So this is where I think our particular skills come in handy, right? So why are people saying that I don't want to do a thing? Why are people saying that I refuse to participate in this or that activity? Why do people say, you know what, I'm going to join this group that hates other people? And I want to come back to one of the things that we talked about at the beginning. And this is where our skills become necessary for society. And it is my belief that those people who are anti-social, right? So even think about that word. So not being social, don't want to be a part of the social order, or society, are in a position where somewhere they don't feel like people are listening or recognizing their need for safety, significance, and belonging. Mm-hmm. And as long as people are hammering and beating their chests about what those people should be doing, we won't move any further, because the basic premise of their antisocial behavior has never been addressed, which is they don't feel like they are getting access to safety, significance, and belonging. And it would be really interesting if folks across these so-called tables sat down and said, you know what, I really want to understand your perspective. Not because I'm preparing my own rebuttal, but I just want to listen to understand. And so I think the lack of that, the lack of the fact that we don't have to do that. When I loved the days of Walter Cronkite, I got 1 minute, the days of Walter Cronkite, because we had one place to get all of our news, and then we could debate what we said about that one thing. But now any idea I have, I can find an internet source to support my idea.
Yep.
Right. So no, I think our skills of mediation is what is going to help us get through these polarized realities, to get to the common truth, and you know, whether common truth is relative or not, or blah blah blah. At the end of the day, if we're going to be in a society, we have to have a common truth, whether that shifts on a regular basis or not. But it has to shift with all of us. Otherwise, we will a house divided cannot stand. Right. So I have 30 seconds. A couple of questions in the chat room. People make choices based on their beliefs, apparent or transparent. Yep, absolutely. Is belief helpful or not? Belief is always helpful, right? Because it is typically the acting out of our value system, right? So I believe, I behave because I believe certain kinds of things, and I believe those things because they're a part of my value system. And so I think behavior, belief, and values are very much in, you know, I've tried to make that point earlier, are very much connected. So I want to say thank you so much for this conversation. It's been wonderful to be with you. It is currently 1 o'clock. We're past our time. I was going to talk about the key takeaways. This week, we were supposed to talk about Johari's window. Forgot about that, but we'll get to that next week. And that's our time together. I appreciate your conversation. Phone a friend, tell a partner, engage with us in these Friday conversations. Look forward to seeing who we become as we continue to navigate this space. My name is Andre Koen. Have a great day. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, Andre.